Namaste and welcome back to Waking Up with Mindful Serenity. And we're going to continue with the answering of questions from the jar. I will pull out a question related to spirituality, and I suggest that you take the term spirituality very loosely and try not to attach too many connotations to it. Spirituality to me, it's just the process of being the best being and the human being I can be, and go about going deeper rather than gaining more. So, that being said, I pull out a question related to that concept, many different questions coming from many different people, as well as from myself. Sometimes I will hear a really good question and I'll jot it down and put it in the jar. And I also will do sometimes a search on the net. What's really good spiritual questions to ask somebody so I can test myself? And I'll jot down those questions and add those to the jar as well. So, that being said, we're not quite sure where the questions are coming from, but I will pull a question from the jar and I'll proceed to answer it within a 10-minute time frame. That being said, I forgot to do my clock, so very quickly I will find my clock on this and I will find my 10 minutes. There we go. Okay. So I'll try to do my best to answer within 10 minutes. And these are very imperfect videos. I am not doing these with any idea that I want to enhance this image of this thing I call me. It's all about the message. And whatever comes out of me in the way that it comes out of me. And it goes up the way that it comes out of me. So it may not always be very, very pretty, but it is what it is. So that being said, I'm going to pull a question from, I think I said that being said 3 times already, didn't I? I'm going to pull a question from the jar, and I'm going to just read it briefly to make sure I can make it out. And I'm going to take a deep breath, and I'm going to exhale, and then I will press my timer. The question I got was, why do I always feel so guilty about everything? Why do I always feel so guilty about everything? And this question goes along with a lot of the other questions I've been answering lately. It seems to be a topic of great interest for myself and others. And I know for myself, I've always tried to explore what guilt and shame were. I even wrote a book called Beyond Fear and Shame, There is Love, in an attempt to understand these feelings that can sometimes be so devastating to our life fulfillment. They can actually block us from maintaining that which we're capable of maintaining and attaining that which we're capable of attaining as human beings. So guilt is one of those emotions that I said belong under the fear realm. And in that book, I came up with or described what I saw in my head was an emotional ladder, a ladder of all the various emotions we can experience as human beings. And emotions is just energy in motion. It's just something we're feeling. It's an energy, a vibration that's inside. So we have within us the capability of being very low on the scale of emotions or very high on the scale of emotions. High is that up feeling, that good, so-called good feeling, though no emotion, I believe, is either good or bad. Just thinking makes it so, from William Shakespeare's Hamlet. But we call it good, okay? So we look at these feelings that are up and energetic and enthusiastic and what we call happy emotions or pleasant emotions. And then we have a middle rung, and below the middle rung, we have what I deem as the fear emotions. Of course, in Miracles also deems it as such. It says that we only have 2 emotions that we're capable of feeling, really, with a lot of subset of emotions underneath them, and that is fear and love. Love is the high energy. Fear belongs to the low energy emotions. And we can go from just basic frustration all the way down the ladder to utter and complete despair. So that being said, there's many rungs from complete despair up to frustration. Right above frustration is the emotion, I believe, that is the bouncing emotion between our feeling really good and our feeling really bad. And that is acceptance. Acceptance. When we get to the point where we feel this certain acceptance, this acceptance of life as it is, the acceptance of the experience of being human as it is. And whatever unfolds in front of us, we learn to just accept it as being it without trying to resist it and push it away. Resistance belongs to the fear emotions. It is a tendency we use when we are wrapped in fear emotions. Anything that begins with acceptance and allowance will allow us to travel up the scale, up the rungs to the highest emotion we can experience, which is probably bliss. So that's the emotional ladder. Now, fear, I said, belongs under the level of acceptance, and guilt is one of those fear emotions. It is devised by guilt. It is operated by guilt. It is maintained by guilt. Guilt is maintained by fear, operated by fear. And when we look at guilt, it is that feeling that we are doing something wrong. We are doing something wrong and we are about to get punished. So we're doing something wrong and we are deserving punishment, whatever form of punishment comes in, and we call that guilt. Okay? Guilt is something often used in the legal system. Someone is either guilty or not guilty. They are deemed such by a jury or by a judge. And in that case, it is one person elected or 12 people elected that select that guilty verdict. So it is not like the same as the social sanctions we get from society when people begin to judge us who maybe not have a right to judge us, and they judge us as guilty. The biggest problem with guilt is that this idea of making guilty. We have this idea of ourselves as separate little beings, a little body, a little mind, and when we're separate, we're very vulnerable, and we have this need to protect ourselves. So we develop what Sue Motor will call protective personalities to keep us safe, and we need that sense of safety. And so when we build that protective personality, we see ourselves as vulnerable and at mercy of attack. Or the need to defend. And what do we use to attack? We often use making guilty to attack other individuals by saying, you are guilty for hurting me. So that way it is a self-protective mechanism. I deem you guilty. I know that if you get punished, then I won't have to feel this way. And then we deem ourselves as guilty because we have, not met social expectations or done something against the social sanctions set out by the society, the cultures that we belong to, which is very relative, by the way, to the moral standards. We haven't met the moral standards, so therefore we are guilty of something. We have made wrong. So we can make others wrong or we can make ourselves wrong. And therefore, with that wrong word, that wrong judgment, we feel we also have the right to penalize and punish. And so we automatically assume that punishment comes with that guilty verdict in one way or another. Of course, we see that in our legal system because there usually is a penalty to pay when someone is deemed guilty in a court of law. But we take that into our social and our day-to-day lives, this making guilty and this punishment in whatever form it comes in. And one of the things we use to make ourselves guilty or make others guilty is guilt. Will make someone feel guilty because there's no worse feeling in the world, I don't think, than shame and guilt. They bring us right down to the dark trenches of that despair. Guilt, we may feel remorse and take accountability for what we do wrong. But when we feel guilt, it's a self-defeating, unproductive emotion. It is unskillful and unwholesome, as the Buddhists would say, because it does not help us to steer back in the right direction and maintain the Eightfold Path, maintain that sense of integrity that we're all seeking to maintain, not because it meets social sanctions, but because it is who we are at the deepest level. So therefore, that being said, let's get back to the question at hand. Why do I feel guilty all the time? We are conditioned to feel guilty from the day we were born. And I don't care what culture you grew up in or what religious affiliation you belong to. We have a tendency to feel guilty because we're made guilty by others. In order to keep our social sanctions functioning, we have to say this is right, this is wrong. So if you do the so-called wrong, you are guilty. And there's this constant guilt making that goes on, this constant judgment from one human being to another in a social group. Are they meeting social expectations? If not, they are guilty. And we project that guilt onto others. And people experience the guilt and therefore slip down the ladder rungs one at a time into those fear emotions. We fear punishment, we fear ostracization, we fear rejection from the group. And that's why we feel guilty. That's why guilt is such a powerful emotion. A person feels guilty because they are conditioned to feel guilty all the time. And if you come to certain religious affiliations where guilt is more enhanced and more conditioned, like in the Catholic Church, for example, and other religions, we're told that we are original sinners. So you were born with the original sin. You were born with the original guilt that you have to carry on your shoulder like a cross. And you need to bear that and carry that and then do your best to repent from that and redeem yourselves from that and to not add any more guilt on top of that. Being human, we're imperfect. We're learning, we're growing, we're expanding, we're testing, we're failing, we're succeeding. We're going to fail just as many times in our morality growth than we are able to succeed. And so guilt is going to be a common emotion many of us feel. It has a lot to do with shame. I always associate guilt with shame. Most of those emotions that belong in the fear level, fear and shame, go hand in hand. And so guilt is we feel wrong for what we did, but shame is we feel wrong for who we are. So it's very, very easy to slip from that rung of guilt down to the rung of shame on the ladder, where we begin to experience not only what we did was wrong, but who we are is wrong. That sense of unworthiness is triggered, that sense of being less than and not enough and bad, wrong, shouldn't be. Not just what we did, but who we are is bad, wrong, shouldn't be. And we're conditioned to feel that as well through our past experiences. So when someone says, I feel guilty all the time, it's probably a triggering of that deep core belief, something they've done embarrassing, or someone says something to them, or someone gets mad at them for something they've done, and they may say, oh, I'm wrong for doing that, and then I am wrong, not just what I did was wrong, but I am wrong, there's something wrong with me, da-da-da-da-da. And that leads to this intensified chronic guilt syndrome that many people feel. So guilt, then, we have to look at is a conditioned, reactive emotion that belongs under the fear realm. So as long as we are operating in fear, as long as we are not accepting life for what it is, as long as we're not accepting ourselves for who we are and the mistakes we made as learners on this planet of learning, as long as we don't accept others, guilt is going to be a very common type of defense and attack mode that we'll be using, according to A Course in Miracles, to regain a sense of okayness with what we're doing. But it keeps us stuck. It keeps us stuck in those fear emotions. So this person who states they feel guilt all the time is feeling it because they've probably been conditioned to feel it. There's a deep core belief likely inside them saying, you were wrong, you're original sinner, you're bad, you can't, you got to redeem yourself. And it's such an exhausting way to go, and constantly trying to redeem yourself from everything, to people please, to succeed at certain things, so you meet social expectations, to be better than, to be more moral or superior moral and more righteous than somebody else. That is exhausting. But you're told by society, almost conditioned, that's the way you go, that's how you relieve guilt, but that's not the way you relieve guilt. You need to realize that guilt is an unnecessary emotion that you're experiencing. If you experience it, it is a vibration like anything else, an energy vibration. It will come in, it can be experienced, it will blow out. But what we do with guilt or anything like guilt or shame is we really push it down into the deep, dark shadows of our beings, because of all things, shame and guilt like the dark. They like to hide in the dark. Shame more so than guilt. But they like to hide in the dark, and they like to grow and fester in the dark. So it's not one of those things we usually talk about. We may admit our guilt in the form of confession to ourselves or somebody else, but we're not likely to admit the shame. And fear, guilt and shame go together. most of the time, or guilt at least will propagate shame. So we just need to be aware of that. And this individual who feels that they're guilty all the time, they realize that this shame samskara, this guilt samskara, these deep core beliefs related to the wrongness or the wrongness of what they do, or their inability to repent enough or redeem themselves enough, is likely the cause of their chronic guilt. So what they need to do is not look outside, not try to redeem themselves in social terms, not try. I mean, of course, we want to meet our social sanctions. We want to live in a healthy society, so we have to do what is known as right. You probably internally feel it as right, but it gets all mixed up in there. You have to allow those old samskaras to release, come up when they're ready to come up. Allow the triggers from life to trigger your samskaras that bring on guilt and shame. Allow these emotions to come up. Allow yourself to experience them, and they will be painful, because what's stored in pain will come up with pain. And thus just allow them to go. Don't cling. Don't stuff. Don't suppress and repress any more of these guilty, shameful feelings. Recognize guilt as a healthy emotion that's in most of us. Recognize it as a vibratory pattern that just wants to be released, and allow it to be released. And sure, follow the social sanctions of your culture and your society, but do so because you know what's right inside, not because you were socially conditioned to. I'm not sure if that made a lick of sense, and I did go over my time again. Forgive me. Thank you so much for joining me. May you have a wonderful day. Namaste.